out harassing the workers and also the ISM activists. She studied, she helped the children study their English, and she learned Arabic from all of them. She worked with women. One woman, when we visited in 2003, very proudly showed us the note that Rachel had left on International Women's Day with the General Union of Palestinian Women, greeting them. She wrote to me, "Know that I have a lot of very nice Palestinians looking after me. I have a small flu bug and got some very nice lemony drinks to cure me. Also, the woman who keeps the key for the well where we sleep keeps asking me about you. She doesn't speak a word of English, but she asks about my mom pretty frequently, wants to make sure I'm calling you." On March 16, 2003, Rachel was brutally crushed by an Israeli Defense Forces Caterpillar D9R bulldozer as she stood between that bulldozer and a Palestinian home threatened with demolition. Members of the family who owned the home, 2 brothers, a pharmacist and an accountant, their wives and 5 young children watched through a crack in their garden wall as the bulldozer approached. Between September 2000 and September 2004, according to Human Rights Watch, over 1,700 homes in Rafah were threatened and eventually demolished as Israeli occupation forces cleared the wide buffer strip and constructed the large steel wall along Rafah's border with Egypt that you saw earlier in the video with Rachel. More than 10% of the population of Rafah lost their homes. Most of these people were refugees. Many were being dispossessed for a second or even third time. In their report, which they issued in 2004, Human Rights Watch stated that the pattern of destruction in the demolition of these homes in Rafah strongly suggests that Israeli forces demolished homes wholesale, regardless of whether they posed a specific threat, in violation of international law. In most of the cases, Human Rights Watch found that the destruction was carried out in the absence of military necessity. The Israeli human rights organizations, like the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions and B'Tselem, have told Craig and me that 60% of the home demolitions that have occurred are clearing demolitions. This is what was happening in Gaza at the time that Rachel was killed. 30% of the demolitions are demolitions because Palestinians are virtually unable to get permits to build, particularly around the Jerusalem area. And there has been a policy in place since 1967 to keep the population of Palestinians around Jerusalem down. And so even though Palestinians may own land that they're on, they're not able to get permits to build or to enlarge their homes. And Craig and I actually witnessed a home demolition in Jerusalem in 2003, one of the many demolitions that happens in that area. At the time that Rachel was there, 10% of the demolitions were punitive demolitions, which are against families whose homes are taken down because a member of the family may have committed an act of violence against an Israeli soldier or Israeli civilian. It could be a suicide bombing, it could be some other form of violence. I point this out because I say to Americans, all of these demolitions are illegal under international law. Here in this country, even the punitive demolitions, which I remind you are only 10% of the demolitions, if somebody in your family committed a crime and the government or a military came in and took down the home of your entire family, we in the United States would not consider that a just act. I also would like you to be aware that in the media, particularly when I was reading about Rachel's case, I would often in AP articles, sometimes in others, see a one-sentence statement that said home demolitions were an Israeli policy to destroy the homes of suicide bombers. They never talked about, in our media, about clearing demolitions or about demolitions because there are different laws for Palestinians than for Israelis around Jerusalem in order to get permits. As Rabbi Michael Lerner said near the time of Gaza disengagement in Tikkun magazine, inch by inch, dunham by dunham, the steady erosion of Palestinian homes and agricultural land continues. The Palestinians see it happening each day. We ignore it and focus on the public relations statements of various political leaders, and thus don't understand why even now there is so much ongoing anger in Palestine. When Rachel stood that day with 7 other internationals from the United States and the United Kingdom between Israeli bulldozers and threatened homes, they stood against oppression. They stood for an end to this immoral occupation. They stood for international law and the human rights of Palestinians and Israelis to be secure in their homes, in their restaurants, on their buses. They stood for self-determination and freedom for the Palestinian people, and they stood for our shared humanity across borders and cultures. Rachel believed that the nonviolent direct action that she was engaged in with Palestinians would not only make Palestinians safer, but also Israelis and Americans, by supporting Palestinians who practice nonviolent resistance and by speeding an end to this conflict that has so damaged both Israeli and American images in the world. Rachel stood there that day because there had been a resolution in the United Nations proposed by Mary Robinson, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to bring an international human rights monitoring force to the region. And that resolution was vetoed by the United States and Israel. And at that time, ISM was formed. Rachel and other activists went in place of such a monitoring force, and people continue to go to do this work. They stood the day Rachel was killed, protesting home demolitions, which are illegal under international law, but demolitions that we in fact support here in the United States with billions of dollars in aid that provides the apparatus for these demolitions. The bulldozers, the Apache helicopters, the F-16s in the area, the APC vehicles, and more. Craig and I believe, in fact, that we, with our tax dollars, purchased the Caterpillar D9R bulldozer that was responsible for our death, or at least partly responsible for our daughter's death. Rachel worked with Israeli peace activists as she tried to understand the destruction of the Palestinian water supply. She received guidance from a reservist in the Israeli military, a father of 2 teenage sons who taught her Hebrew phrases to shout through her megaphone when she encountered bulldozer and tank operators. She was held as she died by Alice, who is a Jewish member of ISM from the UK. When we met Alice, when we first met her on the radio, actually in Democracy Now!, we heard her explain that she has cousins in Israel that she would fear for when she heard about a suicide bombing. And yet Alice stood alongside Rachel and Palestinians in Gaza opposing the Israeli occupation. Rachel joined the growing number of Jewish Americans and Israelis who tell Craig and me that as they work to end the occupation and the violence that it has perpetuated, that they feel they are working to save the soul of Israel. In Rafah, where Rachel was killed, they said she was the woman who came to stop the tanks. In Athens, Greece, they referred to her as she who would not retreat. In her hometown, Olympia, they called her peacemaker. In the very first hours after receiving news of Rachel's killing, Craig and I knew, I think without words passing between us, that her death called for action on our part. Later, we had the privilege of meeting Father Eli Shakur, a Palestinian Catholic priest who was from the Galilean village of Ibalim at the time. He was in Olympia, and in his talk he explained that in the ancient Aramaic, the beatitude, "Blessed are the peacemakers," translates to straighten up yourself, get up, do something, be hungry for justice. Do not be simply